People with depression often say they feel like they are not very smart. I hear people say this all the time in individual therapy sessions, in group therapy sessions. And although this is not true, which we'll be exploring in just a few minutes here, there are a number of reasons why it might seem that way. One of which is that when you're depressed, you have a lot of trouble with daily activities. You struggle to get things done that most people do not struggle to get done. You have a hard time taking care of your house. You have a hard time taking care of your hygiene, going to work, going to school. You look out there in the world and you see most people doing these things, apparently without trouble. Sometimes that's not as true as it looks, but I know what it looks like out there. You see people doing this stuff and they seem fine. You try to do it, you struggle. It's easy to think, well, I must not be very smart. This isn't a measure of your intellect, though. This is a symptom of depression. This is decrease in motivation. This is chronic fatigue. This is your body and your brain not working as well. And that's different than not being smart. Depression also causes difficulties with executive functioning. And so you might have trouble with your focus, your concentration, your memory, your organization. And especially if you can remember a period of time when you weren't struggling with depression or a mood disorder and you didn't really experience that. And you remember feeling like organized and sharp and your memory was good and you were capable. And now everything just feels like this chaotic, jumbled mess inside. And it can really feel like did my brain break? Or did I become stupid? Like what's going on here? Why does my brain not work right? And again, this can make your performance that of someone with lower cognitive abilities than what you actually have, but your brain hasn't actually gotten less talented at doing those things. You are experiencing executive dysfunction as a symptom of a mood disorder. And those symptoms will ebb and flow as your symptoms of depression ebb and flow. So it doesn't actually reflect a decline in cognitive ability, although I certainly understand that it can feel that way. Another symptom of depression that can make us feel not so bright at times is something called psychomotor retardation. And I know that for the context of this conversation, that's kind of an unfortunate name, but I'm not in charge of the names. I think that one, my we like to update names from time to time in mental health. My suspicion is that one is probably going to be coming soon because that's not necessarily the word we want to be using to describe these things, but it basically just means physical and mental slowing. And so when you're experiencing depression, many people experience psychomotor retardation as a symptom, and it kind of feels like your body suddenly weighs like three times more than it actually does, and just everything takes so much effort. And even just like getting out of bed or getting off the couch feels like there's this giant weighted blanket on you that you have to like push up somehow. But it's not just your body, it's your brain too. And people who experience this cognitively, they report feeling almost like their brain is like muddy or foggy. Like there's like a thickness or a density that's getting in the way of like your thoughts completing or connecting to one another. And so we feel very slow. We feel very dysfunctional. And again, this can certainly make you feel and maybe even look like you're not as bright as you used to be. But it is again a cyclical symptom of a cyclical mood disorder. So it doesn't actually reflect your intellect. And then the fourth reason I think it's easy for us to feel this way is that depression also disrupts a lot of things that are important to acute cognitive functioning. So depression can cause insomnia, and without sleep, your brain doesn't work very well. Depression can mess up your appetite. If your appetite's messed up, your brain doesn't work very well. Depression again can cause fatigue, low motivation, sluggishness. It's very difficult for us to like get up and do things and move our bodies when we're feeling depressed. And physical activity is important to cognitive functioning. So all of these temporary states, all of these things that are worsened by depression or by your depressive episode can temporarily make your brain not work right. But I need you to know that those changes are not permanent. Mood disorders don't actually decrease your cognitive ability. They cannot do that. And in fact, although depression can make you feel like you're not the brightest person, the actual correlation, the actual relationship between mood disorders and intellect is the opposite of what it feels like, meaning people who have higher IQ or higher cognitive abilities actually have higher rates of depression and other mood disorders than people of average or lower cognitive abilities. We're going to talk about, there's a few theories why that is. We're going to talk about those theories in just a moment. Before we go to those theories, I just need to make sure you understand when we're talking about like IQ, intellect, cognitive ability, these are all the same thing. They're just interchangeable terms for the same thing. You need to understand what this means because there are a lot of misconceptions on what it means to be, quote, smart. So, intellect or IQ, which is just a numerical value we assign to try to operationalize someone's intellect, all it measures is learning speed. That's literally it. So it's basically like potential. Person with a higher IQ learns things more quickly. They require fewer repetitions of a skill or of a concept before that thing goes from short-term working memory to long-term memory. And at that point, they've memorized it, they can apply it, they can bring it back up into their conscious memory and answer a question about it on a test or in a presentation or whatever. That's literally all it means. And so a person can have a very, very high IQ, but not know a lot of things necessarily because it's still very dependent on your environment. So, like people who grow up in really impoverished countries, for example, s- that might be where like the highest IQ person in the world lives. They may not actually possess the most knowledge in the world because they may not be growing up in a teaching rich environment, but they have the ability to learn more quickly than any other person. And so that's all this measures is how quickly you can learn things. It also doesn't necessarily make you any better at differentiating between good and bad ideas. And so, like, for example, a person with high IQ who grows up in a family who has a lot of kind of like unusual ideas or perhaps even wrong ideas will learn the wrong ideas more quickly than a person of lower IQ. It does not necessarily magically give them better decision-making skills or better social skills or anything like that. That's literally all it means. And so, if you really think about just this idea of learning things more quickly, that's all having a high IQ means, I think you can pretty easily see how that might lead you to actually being more depressed than most people. One is we don't just learn factual information more quickly, we learn everything more quickly, including things that are simply a matter of opinion. And so, people also, we don't just learn like, history from a textbook, right? We also learn like, do people like us? Are we good people? Are we successful people? We develop all these ideas about who we are. And we all have somewhat of an inherent negativity bias, which means we pay a little more attention, or sometimes a lot more attention, to things that hurt than things that feel good because we don't want to get hurt again. So think about rejection, for example. Person of average intellectual ability would need to experience like some certain number or intensity of experience of rejections in order to start developing sort of like a belief system or a complex around rejection. They would probably need to have either one really dramatic experience of rejection or many experiences of rejection before they start to really get worried about it. Before they learn from it, so to speak, and start entering into relationships preparing for rejection or fearing rejection. A person with a very high IQ might experience one relatively normal experience of rejection, because rejection is something we all face to some degree. It might just happen one time, and their brain might use that one experience to form a pattern and to start developing a fear or a complex around rejection because they learn that they are at risk of rejection more quickly because of their higher IQ. They need fewer repetitions of negative experiences before they start to develop belief systems around the negative experience. And I've just used rejection as an example here. This could be anything. If you're a very intelligent person, you might learn an entire belief system and an entire worldview from one relatively normal, unpleasant experience. So if you're walking around with a lot of really difficult to shake negative beliefs about yourself or other people or about the world, it may be because you are a quick learner. And your high IQ has caused you to develop and grow these belief systems more quickly than what most people do, which then starts to put these arbitrary fears or limitations on your life much sooner than most people face those problems. Another problem that people with higher intellectual abilities face is that their minds start to ask questions that they are not yet capable of finding or understanding the answers to. People with high IQ tend to start asking really big picture questions about life really early on. And they don't yet have the emotion regulation skills to cope with the immensity of these questions. I see a lot of, I don't do a ton of counseling with kids, but when I do, it seems like the kids who have the most difficulties with emotional health, with depression, with anxiety, are kids who really early on get stuck on like a super big picture philosophical life question that even adults struggle to answer. And as an adult with a fully formed frontal lobe, you have this wealth of emotion regulation that allows you to cope with all this craziness in life. Like we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we could die at any time, and the economy, like all these, there's all this crazy stuff happening all the time. And most of the time, as adults, we have this emotion regulation system in our frontal lobes that lets us still get up and live life, even though it's kind of this crazy, chaotic, horrible situation, literally always. If you sort of figure that truth out at a young age, when your brain doesn't have those abilities yet, oh, it can really mess you up. It can really mess you up, and that gets compounded if the adults around you, and I don't just mean parents, I mean parents are going to be a big part of it, but teachers, coaches, other family members, mentors, whoever you have, if they don't really know how to walk you through that, if you start asking and being unable to answer deep existential questions at age 7, 8, 9, your brain can't do that yet. It can't work through that. That's hard enough for an adult. And you can get trapped in these thoughts and these questions and these fears with no way to navigate out of it. And in many cases, no help navigating out of it. And when that happens to people, I often see really early onset experiences of depression and sometimes anxiety as well that follow a person well into adulthood and become very difficult to shake. And the need for support around this issue leads me into the third proposed link between high IQ and depression, which is that having higher intellectual abilities can actually be very socially isolating. Having a really strong social support network, friends, family, coworkers, etc., is a really strong buffer against mental illness, including things like depression and anxiety. When we feel connected, when we feel like we're part of a community, that really helps us. And this one's hard for me to say because I often struggle with feeling connected, but the research is clear on this. It is tremendously beneficial. And that's probably part of why it's hard for people with high IQ because I know it's kind of a stereotype, like the socially awkward smart person. Um, but it's a stereotype for a reason. And the reason is when there's a divide between your intellectual abilities and the intellectual abilities of the majority of people you interact with in a day, it's actually really hard to have healthy relationships with people. It makes you very socially awkward because your brain is just like, this is not, I'm the main character elitist. This is just like, this is a reality. It's hard to talk to people. Consider it statistically. An average IQ, 50th percentile, is 100. That's a a normal person. Really, anything from 90 to 109 is within that range. That's the average range. When a person's IQ is 70 or below, that's when they would most likely be diagnosed with an intellectual disability, or what we used to call mental retardation. So keep those two figures in mind. 100 is average, 70 is intellectually disabled. That's a discrepancy of 30 IQ points. That means that if a person has an IQ of 130, which is very high, but not like absurdly uncommonly like those people are out there. You might be one of them, and you probably met one of them. If your IQ is 130, the discrepancy between your IQ and an average person's IQ, and so most of the people you'll interact with, is the same as the discrepancy between an average person's IQ and an intellectually disabled person's IQ. So think of like a person with average cognitive abilities having a conversation with an intellectually disabled person. It can be challenging, right? There are distinct differences in how these people's brains work, and it may be difficult for them to really connect with one another. Not always, but it does just sort of add this extra layer of difficulty, right? If a person has an IQ of 130, that discrepancy exists in almost all of their interactions with everybody. It's very lonely. It's very isolating. It's really hard to talk to people. And it's not necessarily a super awesome thing. It really can be a significant problem. You don't often feel understood by other people. You don't often feel like you belong. You don't often feel like you're accepted because there are just differences. There's differences, and it's really hard to be on the same level, and it's hard to communicate. This is fiction, I know, but the TV show House had a great example of this. There was this man who was having all these mysterious health problems, and no one could figure out why. I know that's literally every episode of the show. They eventually discovered that this person was severely abusing alcohol, and they also discovered that he was a genius. He had I can't remember the exact details, but he'd like published a bunch of books and like patented. He'd invented a bunch of stuff and patented it. I mean, just like a legit genius. And the reason he was abusing alcohol was to create cognitive impairment in himself so that he could actually have like level conversations with his wife or his girlfriend or fiance, whoever it was, who was probably a person of average intellectual abilities. He absolutely loved her with all his heart, but they weren't on the same level. And he found it very difficult to have a conversation with her unless he was drunk. And that's so again, I know that's fictional, but it did a really good job, in my opinion, of showing this dilemma that it's hard to talk to people when your brains are really, really different. And if you have a hard time finding your people and finding places where you fit in, that makes you much more at risk for mood disorders like depression. The fourth potential link for the relationship between high IQ and depression lies with something we call reality testing. And so reality testing measures a person's ability to basically like be aware of and in tune with how things are actually going in the world. So if you have more, or I guess higher reality testing, you have a more accurate sense of what the world is actually like, essentially. Well, this might be the moderating variable between high IQ and depression, because people with higher IQ tend to have better reality testing, but people with better reality testing also tend to be more depressed, which is just a whole thing we could talk about, right? Because essentially what that tells us is the, the more aware you are of what the world is actually like, the sadder you become. And I find it both ironically incredibly depressing, but also incredibly validating. Because the flip side to that is that it suggests that there is a level of denial or disconnection or delusion, even, that is necessary to be consistently happy. And so if you do not feel consistently happy, and you see a lot of people who are, or at least seem to, and you're like, how? Like, how can you feel good and be content when the world is this? Well, 'cause they either unwillingly or willingly don't know how bad things are. I mean, that's really, this is like the worst pep talk ever. I know, but this is what we're dealing with. If you're really in tune with the world, if you really understand the situation we're all in, it doesn't feel great. And some people can kind of shove that to the back of their minds, just carry on and be content. And some of us cannot do that. And that almost certainly seems to have correlates with learning speed and cognitive ability. You learn more quickly. Like most kids sort of have this, like the bright-eyed, the world's a wonderful place view. And, I think at some point that gets dulled by life. And some of us hit that more earlier in life than others. Some of us have that worldview shattered more quickly because something terrible happens to us. Like we face tons of adverse circumstances or trauma really early on in life, and that idyllic childhood phase doesn't last very long or maybe never existed. For some of us, it's not even necessarily that something terrible happened to us. It's like we just figured it out sooner. We just kind of saw through the facade earlier in life than most people. And again, that's going to make life really isolating. It connects with everything we talked about. It's hard to talk to people. It's hard to want to get up and do stuff and care about your life. It really throws you for a loop. So those four reasons are the main theories why people with higher IQ are actually more prone to experiencing depression and other mood disorders. So, in conclusion, being depressed doesn't mean you're stupid. It might actually mean you're really smart. But being smart can suck sometimes because the world is kind of a crappy place. The end.